Hey, welcome to Dr. Osborne's Zone. Today we're going to be talking all about vitamin B5, what you need to know about this very important and often underlooked vitamin that plays a key role in energizing your cells. So we see here vitamin B5, why do we say it energizes cells? One of the biggest reasons is because to convert your energy from carbs, fats, and proteins, these are the food items that you eat, right? They contain macronutrients, carbs, fats, and proteins. This requires vitamin B5. In other words, vitamin B5 plays a major role in helping your body break down biochemically the elements of carbs, fats, and proteins so that you can convert them to energy. And this is one of the big reasons why vitamin B5 is so important. Now, this vitamin was discovered by a famous biochemist by the name of Roger Williams. And Dr. Williams discovered that this vitamin, he actually labeled it the anti-stress and the anti-graying factor. And his research was done, a lot of it was done on mice, and what he found in the mice is that when their diets were devoid of vitamin B5, their brown fur would start to gray, and then when he added B5 back into it, their hair color would actually return. And so this is why it was called the anti-graying factor, later also called the anti-stress factor as a result of its role in stress hormones, which we'll get to. But in my own experience, I've actually seen people come to me where they were severely vitamin B5 deficient, their hair was prematurely graying, and we actually got color coming back into their hair. Now, if you're 70 years old and you've got a full white head of hair, don't expect to take extra high doses of vitamin B5 and have your hair color return. But if you're prematurely graying, this is something you might want to consider having your doctor check you for to see if vitamin B5 could have a potential effect on your hair in that way. Now, if we look at some of the functions of vitamin B5, look up on the screen here, we've got a lot of different functions, but I've highlighted some of the key ones that I think are super important to remember. And one is in the cell membrane formation and structure of the membrane around the cell. This is so important because that membrane around your cell is where all the receptors and channels are embedded. That's how things get in and out of your cells. Waste can get out, nutrients can get in. It's also important to regulate the different receptors and how the receptors embed in the membrane itself. And so these are hormone receptors, and so a lot of the way we react or respond to different chemicals like hormones and neurotransmitters come from the membrane structure formation, all as a result of having adequate vitamin B5. Now, one of the other things B5 does is it is very critical for cholesterol production, and we'll talk more about that. I just want to highlight that, and we'll come back to it in a minute. It's also very critical for the steroid hormone production, the ability to modify cell membrane fluidity, just like in the formation, also in the fluidity. And then we also have it important for energy storage, and then the altering of proteins. So proteins in your body, they're like Legos. They can change shapes, and so vitamin B5 helps in that to happen. And many of your hormones and proteins, they transform and change shapes in order to fit into receptors, in order to become activated. And so vitamin B5 plays a very critical role in that function. So let's move past biochemistry and talk about just kind of fundamental. So this is a big function of vitamin B5. One is that it produces or helps to produce antibodies, and this is important for your immune system to properly function. If you can't make antibodies very well, and we see this a lot in people with gluten sensitivity, one antibody in particular that we see oftentimes is deficient in those with gluten issues is IgA. But remember, IgA is not the only antibody. You've got IgE, IgG, IgM as well. So these 4 different classes of antibodies. There's also IgD, but there's not much known about that. But these other 4 here, these are all very critical. We know their functions. IgE helps regulate histamine release in food allergies. IgG is very critical for immune system function to protect you from different antigens, environmental antigens. IgM is very helpful for infection. So if you can't if you don't have adequate quantities of vitamin B5 and you end up with a suppression of your body's ability to properly produce antibodies, because no, it's not all or none. It's not like, oh, my vitamin B5 is low, therefore I make 0 antibodies. It's a scale, it's a spectrum. So as B5 is low, your ability to produce antibodies can become compromised, and so too can your immune system. And this is why it's very, very important to make sure you're getting adequate B5. And we'll talk about food sources here shortly as far as B5 is concerned. Now, in addition, another nickname for vitamin B5 is anti-stress factor, and it has to do with the role that this vitamin plays in producing corticosteroids. Remember, your body produces cortisol, which does what? It's a very potent anti-inflammatory. So it's very, very important in how our body regulates the inflammatory process. This is why when you go to the doctor with inflammation, a lot of times they want to give you this medication called a corticosteroid, either orally or they want to inject you with it, because it's very, very powerful at combating inflammation. And that remember, when we're inflamed, that's a form of biochemical stress, right? And so you can't make corticosteroids, you can't regulate their production effectively without vitamin B5. And so one of the things that causes depletion of vitamin B5 is increased stress. And whether that stress is physical, there's 3 kinds of stress. Remember, there's physical stress, which is like example here. Most people don't have this problem, but one example would be aggressive exercising, somebody who overtrains, like a marathoner or a triathlete. So aggressive physical training is a form of stress, and we have emotional stress as well, as you can see in the picture here. And then there's also biochemical stress. And what is biochemical stress? This is what most people have today. Biochemical stress would be eating processed foods, preservatives, additives, dyes, and other things in the processed foods. Biochemical stress could also be micronutrient deficiency. Here in this case, we're talking about vitamin B5. And then we also know that biochemical stress can be caused by microbiome disturbances. And there are a lot of things that can contribute to that: pesticide exposures, antibiotics, etc. So think of biochemical stress as stress that you bring in through breathing or through eating, where there's chemical exposures that aren't adequately healthy for you, and your body has to biochemically deal with those stresses. And one of the ways that it deals with it is by signaling your adrenal glands to produce a steroid called cortisol to combat the inflammation. And so again, this is how we cope and adapt to stress. What happens to people over time when they lose their ability to cope with stress, which is a hallmark of vitamin B5 deficiency? It's what happens the longer a person is under excessive stress. Their nutrient status plummets, and then their body loses its resiliency, and then small things become big stresses. And you don't want to get to that situation. It's what some doctors call adrenal fatigue, and it can be life-altering in a bad way.